There are stories buried so deep in the American South that even the land refuses to speak them aloud. Stories the old families deny, the archives erase, and the locals warn outsiders to leave alone. But sometimes a silence becomes suspicious. Sometimes a missing record is louder than a scream. And when a county destroys 12 pages of its own investigation with a razor, you know the truth was never meant to survive. The haunting part is this. What happened at Rosewood Hall was not supernatural. It was worse. It was human. Now let me take you back to the year 1845, to a plantation where two women crossed a line that society had built like a wall. A line so forbidden that both of them ended up dead within hours of each other. And the people in power made sure no one ever learned why. Part 1. The Sealed Records of Rosewood Hall. Approximately 850 to 900 words plus hook equals 1,000 total. Somewhere in the rural parishes of central Georgia stands a house that most locals will not even point to on a map. They call it Rosewood Hall, but only when they must. Anyone who tries to document its history quickly discovers something strange. Between the years 1847 and 1851, the plantation ledgers contain long empty stretches where whole months are missing. These were books that usually recorded every nail purchased and every pound of cotton grown. Yet 4 years are torn apart as if someone wanted time itself to disappear. 2 women died there on the same night. Their deaths were ruled sudden but not suspicious, which was a lie the whole county accepted too quickly. The magistrate sealed the investigation for 50 years. And when the papers were finally opened in 1901, 12 pages had been cut out so neatly that only the binding threads remained. Whoever removed them did not want mistakes. They wanted erasure. Rosewood Hall stood 7 miles outside Milledgeville. At that time Milledgeville was the capital of Georgia. The plantation was placed far enough from the city to hide whatever happened there, but close enough that Thomas Harwell, the owner, could maintain his image among other powerful men. He built the house in 1834 with money from his family's shipping business and the labor of 43 enslaved people. Their names were written in ledgers the same way livestock were listed. Their stories were never written at all. The main house rose 3 stories, built with tall white Doric columns that made visiting planters believe they were stepping into a southern palace. Behind this show of elegance stretched 200 acres of cotton fields, the slave quarters, the overseer's cottage, the smokehouse, and a large kitchen house where fires burned from before sunrise until long past dark. Catherine Beaumont arrived at Rosewood Hall in April of 1845. She had married Thomas Harwell because her family needed a secure match. She was 23, already near what society called an age of concern for unmarried women. Thomas, 37 and recently widowed, needed a wife who could manage his household and give him heirs. Their match made perfect sense to everyone except Catherine. Charleston had raised her differently. There she had been surrounded by sisters and cousins. She had grown up with books, conversations, and the lively noise of a city port. At Rosewood Hall she found none of that. She found a grand house filled with strangers who were not allowed to speak to her except in service. She found neighbors who visited rarely. And she found long silent afternoons when Thomas rode out to inspect his fields or traveled to Milledgeville on business. Her mother had trained her for marriage, but not for loneliness. That was a skill no one believed a woman needed. During her first months Catherine wrote letters almost daily. She supervised the enslaved house servants with an unsure hand. She learned how to smile politely when Thomas spoke about cotton and politics. But by midsummer her letters stopped. The heat of August wrapped the plantation like a heavy blanket. Thomas began taking long trips away. Catherine was left alone in the enormous house with nothing but echoing footsteps and the knowledge that every person around her was forbidden to treat her like a friend. Only one place on the property felt alive. The kitchen house. The building stood 30 yards behind the main residence, connected by a covered walkway. It smelled of rising bread and simmering stew. The flames from the cooking hearth cast the room in warm tones. Pans clattered. Voices murmured softly. To Catherine it felt like a real heart beating inside a body made of wood and silence. Delphine ran the kitchen. She was 24, born at Rosewood Hall, and had learned the craft of cooking from her mother Celia, who had once been the head cook. Delphine knew how to butcher meat, preserve vegetables, manage supplies, and command the younger kitchen workers. Her skill made her too valuable to sell. Her intelligence kept her careful. She understood the difference between safety and danger better than anyone in the great house. Catherine visited the kitchen at first out of curiosity. Later she told herself she visited to help with household management. But the truth was simpler. She visited because she felt something there she felt nowhere else. Warmth, noise, life, and Delphine's presence drew her in a way she could not explain to herself. Their first true conversation happened in September. Catherine entered to discuss the menu for a dinner Thomas planned for other planters. She found Delphine kneading dough. The quiet rhythm of her hands made Catherine stand still longer than she meant to. Catherine asked who had taught her to cook. It was the kind of question no white mistress was supposed to ask. It acknowledged Delphine as someone with a past. Delphine answered with caution. She said her mother had taught her. Catherine should have stopped there, but she asked a second question. She asked if Delphine missed her mother. The silence that followed was dangerous. Delphine looked at her with steady eyes, not defiant, not fearful, simply measuring the meaning of the question. When she finally answered, her voice was soft. She said she missed her every day. That night Catherine lay awake beside her sleeping husband. She kept hearing that voice. She felt unsettled, shaken, almost frightened by something she could not name. She returned to the kitchen house the next day. And the next. She sat near the fire with her needlework. Delphine spoke cautiously about safe subjects. Catherine spoke about Charleston, about books, about the quiet in her heart that felt like hunger. She did not know it yet. Delphine sensed it before she did. But that small flame of companionship would be enough to threaten the world they lived in. And at Rosewood Hall, nothing that threatened the rules survived for long. If you want part 2 next, I will continue with rising tension, emotional danger, and a slow drift toward the horrifying night the records tried to erase. Engaging hook for part 2. Some secrets do not stay quiet. They breathe, they grow, and they wait for the moment someone makes a single wrong move. At Rosewood Hall the wrong move was not a scream in the night or a shadow in the hallway. It was a look. It was a touch. It was a feeling that should never have existed between a planter's wife and an enslaved woman. The danger was not a ghost watching them. The danger was the world they lived in, a world that punished affection harder than murder, and every heartbeat they shared pulled them closer to the disaster that history tried so desperately to erase. Now let me take you back to the year 1846, when Catherine and Delphine crossed a line that no one in their world could survive crossing. Part 2. The kiss that changed Rosewood Hall forever. Approximately 1,000 words. Delphine understood the danger long before Catherine did. Catherine felt lonely and trapped. Delphine felt something far sharper. She knew Catherine's attention could protect her one day and destroy her the next. In the world they lived in, survival depended on perfect behavior. Any suspicion of impropriety could send Delphine to the auction block or worse. She knew the rules. She had lived them since childhood. She should have kept her distance. She should have stayed entirely professional. But Delphine was human, and she was lonely in ways Catherine could never fully understand. She had grown up at Rosewood Hall. She had watched her mother die from fever. She had seen friends sold away with no warning. She had watched people she loved vanish into the cotton markets of Savannah or the plantations of Alabama. Her brother Marcus came to her after long days in the field so exhausted he could barely speak. The younger kitchen workers obeyed her but kept emotional distance. She had no one to talk to. No one to trust with her thoughts. No one who saw her as anything more than a cook or property. So when Catherine looked at her with genuine interest, something inside Delphine softened in spite of every warning her instincts screamed. Their conversations deepened slowly. At first they talked about safe subjects. Recipes, schedules, household needs. But as the months passed, Delphine shared small pieces of herself. She spoke about her observations of people. About memories of her mother. She made Catherine laugh, and that laughter felt like a small freedom no one could steal from her. By the spring of 1846 they had built a rhythm, a dangerous one, but neither could walk away from it. Catherine began spending whole afternoons in the kitchen house. She pretended she was learning how to run the household, but the truth was she simply wanted to be near Delphine. Delphine responded with her own quiet offerings. She made pastries and small dishes that she claimed were tests of new recipes, but both of them knew what they really were. They were small gifts, pieces of attention and affection disguised as kitchen work. The shift from friendship to something more did not happen all at once. It happened in small touches. Catherine reaching up for a jar and leaning too close. Delphine steadying her elbow when she slipped on the uneven floor. Their hands brushing when passing a bowl. A shoulder touched during a laugh. A moment of stillness when they realized their hands were still touching. These touches were nothing by themselves. But together they formed something that felt like possibility. And possibility was forbidden at Rosewood Hall. Catherine had been raised to believe that people like Delphine were different from white women. Delphine had been raised to believe that white women like Catherine were dangerous. Both were discovering that everything they had been taught was designed to keep them apart. Then came the night the world changed. It happened in late May. Thomas had been gone for 2 weeks. A spring storm rolled in fast, the kind that turns the sky a strange green and sends the animals running for shelter. Catherine had been in the kitchen when the rain began. Instead of returning to the main house, she stayed where the heat of the fire kept the storm at bay. She and Delphine stood near the window watching the rain sheet across the yard. Lightning flashed. Thunder shook the walls. The smell of wet earth drifted through the open shutter. Catherine turned her face toward Delphine. Something in her eyes asked a question without words. Delphine should have stepped away. She knew this moment could ruin her life. She knew that no one would protect her if this was discovered. She knew how quickly affection could become danger for someone in her position. Yet she leaned forward. Their lips touched. The kiss was gentle and brief, but it held more truth than anything either woman had spoken aloud. When they pulled apart, they stared at each other in the dim room, breathing fast, both terrified by what they had done. Delphine whispered that they could not continue. Catherine cried and said she did not care anymore. But Delphine cared. She cared because she had to. Catherine's ruin would bring shame and scandal. Delphine's ruin would bring pain and blood. They should have ended it there. But loneliness is stronger than reason, and longing is more powerful than fear. A week later, Catherine returned to the kitchen house after dark when the others had gone to the quarters. This time there were no hesitations. What followed over the next months created a bond that defied every rule of their world. They built secrets together. Catherine sent the younger workers on errands to clear the room. She took her meals in the kitchen to spend more time with Delphine. She brought books and read aloud while Delphine cooked. They talked about their lives as if they were not trapped in roles neither had chosen. Delphine taught Catherine how to bake bread and judge seasoned meat with her hands. Catherine offered stories of Charleston and described the sea she missed. For brief moments their unequal world faded. But it never stayed gone. Delphine always carried the knowledge that Catherine could destroy her without meaning to. She always knew her brother's safety depended on Thomas Harwell's satisfaction. She always knew she was risking everything. The first person to notice the danger was Marcus. He came to the kitchen in August and found his sister staring into the fire with an expression between joy and terror. He asked her what was happening. Delphine told him the truth because she had never lied to him. Marcus reacted with panic. He told her Catherine would get her killed. He told her Catherine would get them both killed. He warned her that nothing Catherine said could change the reality of the system they lived in. And Delphine knew he was right. But she also knew it was already too late to stop what had begun. If you want part 3, I will continue with rising danger, the overseer's suspicion, Marcus's attempts to intervene, and the first signs that someone at Rosewood Hall had begun to watch them. Engaging hook for part 3. Some endings arrive quietly, others come like a witness standing in a doorway with cold eyes and a mind already forming a plan. At Rosewood Hall the end began with a single open door on a winter night. One moment of careless love. One pair of watching eyes. And in that instant every secret that Catherine and Delphine had protected for months turned to smoke. Secrets at Rosewood Hall did not stay hidden. They turned into punishments. They turned into chains. They turned into the kind of terror that does not scream but whispers. This is the night everything changed. This is the night their love became a crime that could not be forgiven. Part 3, The Night Judith Saw Everything. About 1,000 words, simple language, no dashes. Delphine had always known the truth. Marcus said it again and again. He said it because he loved her. He said it because he wanted her alive. He reminded her that Catherine was white and she was not, and that this single difference would destroy everything when the story reached the wrong ears. He told her that their world had only one ending for relationships like this. Delphine knew he was right. She had lived her entire life learning these rules. She knew that affection could turn into danger without warning. She knew that hope was a knife that cut the moment she relaxed her guard. But she was 25 years old, and for the first time in her life someone looked at her as if she mattered. Catherine saw her as a person with thoughts and dreams and a soul. That kind of recognition felt like sunlight in a place that had been dark for too long. After feeling that light, going back to the old emptiness felt unbearable. Maybe it will not end, Delphine whispered one night. She knew the words were a lie even as she said them. It always ends, Marcus answered. You know that. Everything we care about, they take it away. That is what they do. He spoke from a lifetime of loss. Their mother taken by fever. Their older sister sold south when Marcus was 10. Their father sold before he was even born. Every bond had been broken by someone with more power. Love, in their world, meant pain followed by more pain. But knowing something and acting on it are two different things. Delphine could not walk away. She kept seeing Catherine. She kept building a connection that had no place in their world. They created something that had no word in their language and no future in their society. They gave it no name, but they protected it with every breath. They became more careless, more hopeful, more desperate. Catherine began sneaking to the kitchen house at night, moving like a shadow once Thomas fell asleep. She stayed until moments before dawn. Delphine would slip away to start breakfast with the faint smell of Catherine still clinging to her skin. In those hours they lived in an unreal world where morning did not exist and where no one had the power to take anything from them. But morning always came. Catherine changed in ways others noticed. She moved with a softness she had never shown before. She smiled for no reason. She looked brighter, almost glowing, as if someone had lit a candle behind her eyes. The neighboring plantation wives whispered about how marriage must be agreeing with her. They complimented her happiness. They assumed it came from her husband. The idea that a white woman's joy could come from an enslaved woman did not exist in their universe. Thomas saw the change too, but his mind went to the most obvious explanation. He believed his wife had finally settled into her proper role. He had no reason to suspect anything else. In his view of the world, such a thing could not happen. But impossible things happen every day. By the fall of 1846 Delphine and Catherine knew they were in love. They did not speak the word aloud. It was too dangerous. But they dreamed impossible dreams. They spoke of escape. They imagined buying Delphine's freedom. They planned a future in which the world would not own Delphine's body or decide Catherine's choices. These dreams had no foundation in reality. They were fantasies that kept them alive. Then came Judith Harwell. Thomas's unmarried sister arrived in November. Judith was a woman who had been raised to rule but given no kingdom. She had a sharp mind and a cold heart. She had spent her entire life trained to oversee plantations but forced to depend on her brother for everything. That bitterness sharpened her vision. She noticed everything that broke the rules. She loved nothing more than putting a household back in its proper place. Judith noticed the danger at once. She saw how often Catherine visited the kitchen house. She saw the glow in Catherine's face when Delphine entered a room. She saw the small touches, the soft glances, the quiet smiles. One gesture meant nothing. A pattern meant everything. Judith knew the hidden ways of the South. She knew the secret relationships white men had with enslaved women. She knew how intimacy twisted behind closed doors. She had seen every form of forbidden closeness except this one. What she saw between Catherine and Delphine was different, and different was dangerous. She began watching them more carefully. She appeared at odd times. She asked sharp questions. She studied both women with the intensity of someone hunting proof. Catherine should have known better. She had been raised in a world where every action was observed. But the kitchen house felt safe. She forgot the rules. She forgot the danger. Love makes people foolish. The discovery came on a cold night in December. Judith woke after midnight and saw a light still burning in the kitchen house. She dressed and crossed the yard, telling herself she needed to check for a fire hazard. When she opened the door, she found Catherine and Delphine standing close, too close, with Catherine's hand resting on Delphine's face in a gesture that revealed everything. They froze. All three stood locked in a moment that felt carved in stone. Judith's face passed through confusion, recognition, and finally horror. Catherine stepped back as if struck. Delphine dropped her gaze to the floor, every instinct telling her to make herself small, silent, and harmless. Judith spoke with cold clarity. It is exactly what it looks like. You disgrace this family. You pollute this household with something vile. The word vile hung in the room like a curse. Catherine begged her not to tell Thomas. Judith said she had no choice. She said this was not a simple mistake. This was something she had no language for. She said the entire household must be corrected. She said Delphine must be removed at once. Catherine cried out that she would do anything. Judith silenced her with a single command. She reminded Catherine that she had no authority. She said Thomas would hear everything. She said Catherine might lose her marriage. She said Delphine would be sold far south. Delphine tried to take the blame. Catherine refused to let her. She confessed everything. She said she chose Delphine. She said she loved her. Judith could not understand it. She looked at them like they were creatures she had never seen before. She said Catherine had ruined herself for something that was never real. Catherine said it was real. She said nothing Judith did could erase that. Judith walked out into the freezing night. The door slammed behind her. It sounded like a sentence being passed. Catherine reached for Delphine. Delphine stepped back, and that small movement cut deeper than a knife. They both knew this was the end of their world. If you want part 4, I will continue with the fallout, Thomas's reaction, the horror that follows, and the moment Catherine and Delphine learn what punishment truly means at Rosewood Hall. Engaging hook for part 4. When secrets explode, the walls that once kept them hidden become their prison. Rosewood Hall had always been a place of control, order, and silence. But once Judith discovered the truth, everything began to unravel. In the hours that followed, love, fear, and violence collided. What Catherine and Delphine built in stolen moments now faced the full force of a world determined to punish them. Tonight, nothing would remain safe. Part 4. The Aftermath of Discovery. The morning sun barely touched the frost-covered yard when Thomas Harwell arrived home from his trip to Savannah. Rosewood Hall, usually orderly and pristine, felt tense in a way he could not immediately place. The servants moved quietly, casting cautious glances at one another, and a strange weight hung over the household. Judith met him in the hallway, her face pale but resolute. She spoke quickly, her words cutting through the still air. Thomas, puzzled by her urgency, followed her to the main parlor. There, she told him everything. She described the late-night visits, the lingering touches, the moments of closeness that should not have existed. She did not soften her account. She told him exactly what she had seen, and the effect was immediate. Thomas's first reaction was disbelief. The very idea that his wife, his carefully chosen wife, could betray him in this way was beyond comprehension. His mind raced. Rosewood Hall had rules. Society had rules. Everything he had known to be true about the world was structured to prevent such transgressions. And yet, the evidence Judith presented left no room for doubt. He stormed to the kitchen house, moving faster than any man of his age should in the chill of early morning. The sight that greeted him was everything he had feared. Catherine and Delphine were seated near the fire, hands hovering too close together, faces flushed, caught in the intimate aftermath of moments meant to be private. Thomas's anger was immediate and violent. He demanded explanations, his voice rising and echoing through the kitchen house. Catherine stood, trembling but defiant. She admitted her feelings, her longing, and the love she could no longer suppress. Delphine, careful and poised despite the danger, spoke of her own heart, though she knew that speaking too boldly could mean death. Thomas could not comprehend their words. Love, desire, intimacy between a white woman and an enslaved woman, challenged everything he believed. His mind sought control, but the reality before him escaped every framework he had ever learned. For a moment, he hesitated, frozen by the impossible. Then fury consumed him. The household erupted into chaos. Judith barked orders, sending servants to fetch overseers and locks. Thomas demanded Delphine be removed immediately. He spoke of punishment, of sales, of whipping, as if words alone could reassert the authority that had been violated. But Catherine stood in his way, pleading, defiant, insisting that Delphine had done nothing wrong. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause. The room held a breathless tension. Catherine and Delphine's love, fragile and impossible, glimmered in the midst of the storm. And then Thomas acted. Delphine was seized and dragged from the kitchen house, her pleas muffled by the sound of boots on the floorboards. Catherine followed, desperate, but Thomas forced her back, insisting she remain within the main house while he decided what would become of both women. The sense of helplessness that swept through the kitchen house was suffocating. Every object, every fire, every shadow seemed to whisper danger. Catherine returned to the main house, her mind racing, heart pounding. She tried to hold herself steady, to compose a face of obedience, but her thoughts were filled with Delphine. She could not stop imagining her hands, her smile, her voice. In that instant, Catherine realized that love, even when impossible, was stronger than fear. But the fear remained. Meanwhile, Delphine was confined to the overseer's cottage. The room was small, cold, and stripped of the autonomy she had enjoyed in the kitchen house. She could not cook, could not move freely, could not create the world she had built with Catherine. Her mind raced with fear for herself and for Marcus, whose presence on the plantation now seemed even more precarious. She understood, more acutely than ever, that her value as property was the thin thread keeping her alive. One wrong move could unravel everything. That night, the plantation was silent, but it was not peaceful. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind through the cracks, felt like a threat. Catherine could not sleep. She paced her room, praying, remembering, hoping. Every hour that Delphine remained under threat was a dagger in her heart. She longed to see her, to touch her, to reassure her that nothing had changed between them despite the danger. And Delphine, alone in the overseer's cottage, was not idle. She was planning, not escape yet, but strategy. She knew that survival required patience, intelligence, and silence. She recalled every lesson of her life on the plantation, read the moods of the masters, the servants, the family. Timing was everything. One wrong step, one impulsive act, and they would both pay with freedom, safety, and perhaps life itself. The tension between Catherine and Delphine became a new kind of horror. It was not the fear of ghosts or curses. It was the horror of a world built to destroy their love, to erase every connection, to punish desire where it should not exist. Every glance through the window, every whispered word under cover of darkness, became a test of courage and cunning. By morning, the household had shifted. Catherine maintained a composed face, attending to her duties with the calm precision of someone holding a storm in her chest. Delphine returned to the kitchen house, but under strict supervision. The other servants watched closely, knowing that any small misstep could provoke punishment. The weight of scrutiny was oppressive, as if the walls themselves had eyes. Yet, despite everything, their love endured. It persisted in stolen moments, in brief glances, in subtle gestures that none could notice but themselves. It was fragile, dangerous, and forbidden, but it was real. And the knowledge of its fragility made each moment more precious. Rosewood Hall, with its Doric columns, vast fields, and imposing halls, had always been a place of order and domination. Now it was a place where fear and desire collided in secret. Catherine and Delphine had survived the first wave of discovery, but they knew that the danger had only begun. Every day forward would require cunning, courage, and a measure of luck that the world had rarely granted them. Outside, the wind blew through the Spanish moss, a soft whisper across the yard. Inside, two women clung to a truth that society would not allow. They had faced the first consequence of love in a world built on ownership. The next consequences, they knew, could be far worse. If you want, I can create part 5 next, where Thomas begins punishing the household, the full threat to Delphine emerges, and Catherine's defiance escalates, keeping the story tense and horrifying for your American YouTube audience. Do you want me to continue with part 5? Engaging hook for part 5. In Rosewood Hall, secrets have a way of breaking through even the strongest walls. Catherine and Delphine's forbidden love had survived exposure, but the storm of power, fear, and punishment was only beginning. When the master of the house becomes aware of betrayal, no one is safe. Tonight, the plantation will show the dark lengths some will go to protect order and destroy what cannot be controlled. Part 5. The storm hits Rosewood Hall. Winter arrived early in central Georgia that year, and with it came a sharpness to the air that matched the tension within Rosewood Hall. Catherine moved through the grand halls as if walking on ice. Every creak of the floorboards made her flinch. Every glance from a servant felt like a question she could not answer. The knowledge of what had been seen, what had been discovered, hovered over the estate like a storm cloud ready to break. Thomas Harwell was quieter than usual, his anger simmering beneath the surface. He spent hours reviewing accounts, inspecting the cotton fields, and summoning the overseer to discuss the discipline of his property. But Catherine knew that his mind was consumed by one thought alone, the betrayal that had occurred under his roof. Delphine's life had become a delicate balance. She was allowed back in the kitchen house, but only under strict observation. Her every move was watched, her interactions limited. Marcus, ever vigilant, warned her to stay calm, to act as if nothing had changed. But every glance at Catherine, every small smile or gesture, reminded her that the fire between them was still alive. The first act of punishment came suddenly. Thomas summoned the younger kitchen workers and demanded that they recount everything they knew. The room was silent, tense, and suffocating. Fear had replaced loyalty. The smallest slip of the tongue could bring a whipping, a sale, or worse. Yet, despite the pressure, the servants said nothing. Delphine had taught them well. Survival often meant silence. Catherine watched from a distance, her heart pounding. She wanted to step forward, to plead for Delphine, to confess everything. But she understood that speaking now would endanger Delphine beyond the limits either of them had endured. Her defiance had to be measured, careful, hidden. Every word had to serve both their survival and their love. Thomas's attention shifted quickly to Catherine herself. He began to question her about her daily routines, her management of the house, her interactions with the servants. Each question was a test, a probe, a way to catch her in some misstep. Catherine answered with precision, but her mind was elsewhere, spinning with fear and strategy. Every answer she gave was designed to protect Delphine. Every word had to conceal the truth of her heart. Judith continued her surveillance. She moved through the house like a shadow, observing, listening, noting any unusual behavior. Catherine and Delphine knew that the smallest gesture, a hand lingering too long, a glance held too long, could be noticed, reported, and punished. And yet, the stolen moments continued. They found ways to pass notes hidden in books, to touch briefly while performing household tasks, to communicate in subtle gestures. One evening, after a long day of inspections and commands from Thomas, Catherine slipped from the main house, claiming she needed to check supplies in the kitchen house. Delphine waited near the fire, pretending to adjust a pot. The instant Catherine stepped inside, she crossed the room and reached for Delphine's hand. Their fingers touched briefly, dangerously, but neither spoke. Words were unnecessary. They had learned to communicate in silence, in subtle movements, in fleeting contact that no one could detect but them. But that night, the tension of the household boiled over. Thomas returned unexpectedly, having forgotten an important ledger in the main house. The sudden sound of boots on the walkway made both women freeze. Delphine ducked behind a counter, and Catherine pressed herself against the wall, hoping to appear as if she had been standing idle. Thomas entered the kitchen house, frowning. He noticed the fire had been stirred recently, that the kettle had been used, that a pot sat slightly askew. Small details, but enough to spark suspicion. His eyes narrowed. Catherine, pretending composure, approached him. She explained that she had been checking stock, that the fire needed attention, that Delphine was following her instructions. For a moment, Thomas hesitated. His instincts told him something was wrong. But he lacked proof. And in his mind, the idea of a white woman seeking intimacy with an enslaved woman was almost unthinkable. He chose to suppress the doubt, returning to the main house with a lingering unease that made the walls of Rosewood Hall feel smaller and heavier. That night, Catherine and Delphine sat together, whispering in low tones. They knew the danger had escalated. Each moment of contact was now a risk of punishment, sale, or death. Yet, their love had deepened beyond what either could deny. The world outside had become a cage, and the kitchen house a fragile sanctuary in which they could breathe freely, if only for a few hours each day. But Rosewood Hall did not forgive or forget. Whispers began among the servants. Some noticed the stolen glances, the small favors that seemed more than duty. Fear spread like wildfire. One of the younger kitchen workers, jealous of Delphine's authority, began observing her too closely, recording details in her mind for later. Catherine and Delphine knew that someone would eventually speak. It was only a matter of time. Winter dragged on. The nights grew longer, the fires hotter, the risk greater. Catherine continued to defy the social order with quiet courage, visiting Delphine when she could, speaking words of comfort, reading aloud stories of distant cities, imagining lives beyond the plantation walls. Delphine, for her part, maintained composure, performing her duties with skill while planning every movement, every glance, every gesture to minimize risk. In those months, the bond between them became unbreakable. Love had grown in the shadow of danger, becoming a force stronger than fear itself. They had built a hidden world, a universe within the walls of Rosewood Hall where they could exist as equals, if only for stolen moments. But the threat was always present. Judith remained vigilant, Thomas remained suspicious, and the eyes of the household seemed everywhere. They understood that a single misstep could destroy everything. Yet, despite the danger, neither Catherine nor Delphine could stop themselves from reaching for each other, from speaking in hushed tones, from dreaming of a life beyond the plantation. Rosewood Hall had become both prison and haven. It was a place of power and control, and yet it could not contain the truth of what had grown there between two women who had dared to love in a world built to destroy that love. The question now was no longer whether their secret could remain hidden. The question was how long they could survive the consequences. And as the cold winter winds rattled the windows, Catherine and Delphine understood that the storm had only just begun. If you want, I can create part 6 next, where Thomas and Judith escalate their measures, the household faces severe punishment, and Catherine and Delphine must make life or death decisions, continuing the suspense and horror for your American YouTube audience. Do you want me to continue with part 6? Engaging hook for part 6. At Rosewood Hall, secrets are dangerous, and love is a weapon. Catherine and Delphine had survived suspicion, but the walls of the plantation are closing in. One careless word, one glance, could destroy them both. Tonight, fear, desire, and the rigid rules of society collide, and the consequences will be more terrifying than either of them could imagine. Part 6. The house turns against them. Winter deepened, and Rosewood Hall became a place where shadows seemed longer, whispers colder, and every creaking floorboard carried a warning. Catherine moved through the house carefully, every gesture measured, every step calculated. She could no longer trust that she could simply walk into the kitchen house without drawing suspicion. Delphine sensed the tension too. The air around the main house had shifted. Servants avoided the kitchen house when they could, moving silently and keeping their eyes down. Something in the household had changed. The fragile balance that had protected their stolen moments was breaking. The first blow came one morning when Thomas Harwell summoned Delphine to the main house. She entered the study with her heart pounding. He was seated behind a desk, the morning light falling harshly on his stern face. His hands rested on the ledger he had been reviewing, but his eyes were not on numbers. They were on her. "Delphine," he said, his voice even but cold. "Do you understand what it means to betray your master?" Delphine swallowed hard, her mind racing. Every instinct screamed for her to bow, to apologize, to explain nothing. "Yes, sir," she said quietly, keeping her eyes lowered. "Do you understand the consequences?" he asked, leaning forward. "Consequences for you, your brother, and everyone who allows this to happen in my house." Delphine nodded. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in. She knew she could not speak the truth. Catherine could not be implicated, not yet. Yes, sir, she repeated. Thomas's gaze sharpened. He studied her, searching for lies, for hesitation, for a flicker of defiance. He found none. Very well, he said, rising. You will continue your duties in the kitchen. But know this, any deviation from absolute obedience, any hint of impropriety, and there will be punishment. Severe punishment. Delphine bowed, barely breathing. She understood the warning. It was not just about rules. It was about control, about fear, about the plantation's rigid order. She had to survive. When she returned to the kitchen house, Catherine was waiting, her face pale and worried. What did he say? Catherine whispered. Delphine hesitated. He knows nothing specific. Yet, she said, her voice low, he suspects. Catherine reached for her, grasping her hands tightly. We can't be careless, she said. Not anymore. No, Delphine agreed. Not for a single second. The days that followed were tense. Catherine and Delphine communicated in whispers, glances, and coded gestures. Every routine interaction with servants, every meal preparation, every delivery of supplies became an exercise in subterfuge. They learned to hide their presence in plain sight, to appear distant while remaining close, to touch without being seen. But secrecy cannot hold forever. Judith's watchful eyes were relentless. She moved through the house like a shadow, observing, questioning, creating situations designed to expose the bond between the two women. Catherine noticed the glances, the sudden appearances, the carefully phrased questions. She realized Judith was setting a trap. One evening, Catherine risked slipping into the kitchen house after Thomas had gone to bed. Delphine was there, alone, tending the fire. Catherine took her hands, feeling the warmth through the cold night air. We can't last much longer, Catherine whispered. He will find out. Delphine's eyes were steady, though her heart raced. We have to be careful, she said. We can survive this. But only if we are clever. Only if we are invisible. Catherine nodded. The idea of invisibility seemed impossible. They had already been seen in secret. Their love, their connection, their very presence defied every rule of Rosewood Hall. But Delphine was right. They had survived suspicion before. They could survive again. The first real test came when Thomas returned unexpectedly from a business trip. He had been away for only a day, but he entered the kitchen house without warning, startling them both. The firelight flickered across the room, illuminating the tension on their faces. Catherine froze, her hands on Delphine's arms. Delphine dropped her eyes immediately. Why are you two here at this hour? Thomas demanded. His voice was sharp, carrying the authority that had governed Rosewood Hall for years. Catherine stepped forward. I was checking supplies, sir, she said. Her voice was steady, though her heart pounded. Delphine was assisting me. Thomas's eyes swept over Delphine. He said nothing at first, but the silence was worse than any accusation. Finally, he nodded curtly. Very well. But remember, he said, I expect order. Absolute order. I will not tolerate chaos in my household. They exhaled, barely, realizing they had survived yet another close encounter. But the danger was growing. Each day, the risk of discovery, of punishment, of sale, became more immediate. Then came the whisper of betrayal from within the household. One of the younger servants, jealous of Delphine's authority and wary of Catherine's favor, began spreading rumors. Small, seemingly innocuous phrases. Miss Catherine spends too much time in the kitchen. Delphine is not as obedient as she should be. I think they are hiding something. Judith, ever vigilant, began collecting these whispers like pieces of evidence. She started to create a story in her mind, a narrative of betrayal, perversion, and danger. And once the story was complete, she would present it to Thomas. Catherine and Delphine sensed the growing threat. They could feel the walls closing in, the air growing heavier, the house itself conspiring against them. Yet, despite the fear, despite the danger, their bond only strengthened. The stolen moments, the secret glances, the whispered words, they had become lifelines in a world determined to destroy them. That winter, Rosewood Hall became both prison and battlefield. Catherine and Delphine fought to survive, to protect each other, to maintain their love in the face of a society that could not acknowledge it. They understood that the coming months would test them beyond anything they had endured. And they also understood that survival might demand sacrifices neither was willing to make. Outside, the cold wind rattled the shutters, and the shadows lengthened across the floors. Inside, the tension was palpable, the danger immediate. Catherine and Delphine were no longer simply hiding, they were plotting, planning, and preparing for the moment when the walls of Rosewood Hall would no longer contain the storm. They had survived suspicion, survived judgment, survived fear. But could they survive the fury of the master and the scrutiny of his family? Only time would tell. And time, at Rosewood Hall, was never kind. If you want, I can create part 7 next, where Judith and Thomas close in, and the stakes escalate to a terrifying confrontation that could destroy everything Catherine and Delphine have built, keeping the suspense high for your American YouTube audience. Do you want me to continue with part 7? Engaging hook for part 7. At Rosewood Hall, the walls have ears, and the shadows have eyes. Catherine and Delphine's secret love has survived whispers, storms, and suspicion, but now the danger is no longer distant. Judith and Thomas are closing in, and one wrong move could destroy them both. Tonight, fear will collide with desire, and the true horror of power and obsession will be revealed. Part 7. The storm closes in. Winter's chill had not abated, and Rosewood Hall felt more oppressive than ever. The plantation, usually alive with the muted rhythms of labor, now carried a weight of tension that even the wind seemed to recognize. Every creak of the floors, every rattle of a shutter, every faint noise in the halls became a signal, a warning. Catherine moved through the house with careful steps, eyes flicking toward corners and doorways as if they were capable of betrayal. Delphine's life had grown even more perilous. She moved like a shadow, carrying out her duties with mechanical perfection. Yet beneath the calm exterior, a storm raged. The knowledge that Judith was watching, always watching, made every glance, every word, every small gesture a potential threat. Even a shared smile could be the spark that ignited their destruction. Judith's presence in the house was suffocating. She prowled through rooms, checking doors, counting the hours Catherine and Delphine spent apart. Her sharp gaze missed nothing. Servants whispered nervously to each other about her sudden, unpredictable inspections. Catherine noticed how her visits to the kitchen house became fraught with tension, each moment alone now a gamble that could ruin them forever. One evening, Catherine decided she could not stay silent any longer. She risked slipping into the kitchen house after Thomas had gone to bed. Delphine was tending the fire, the room warm with the glow of flames, the smell of baking bread comforting yet bittersweet. Catherine's hands found Delphine's, their fingers brushing, lingering. "We can't keep doing this," Catherine whispered, fear threading through her voice. "They are closing in. Judith is clever. Thomas is perceptive. One mistake." Delphine interrupted her gently. "I know," she said, her voice low. "We have survived suspicion before. We can survive it again. But we must be careful. Every second counts." Careful. The word itself felt like a cage. Every smile, every touch, every word had to be measured. Yet even with the risk, their love persisted, burning brighter in the face of danger. It had become their only refuge from the cold, empty world that the plantation insisted they inhabit. The first real confrontation came sooner than they expected. Thomas had returned unexpectedly from Savannah, earlier than his usual trips allowed. Catherine and Delphine had barely noticed the time pass, absorbed in stolen conversation, when they heard his footsteps on the walkway. Their hearts froze. Thomas entered the kitchen house without warning. The firelight flickered across his stern face, casting shadows that made him appear taller, more commanding. "Why are you two here at this hour?" His voice was sharp, carrying the weight of authority that had long governed Rosewood Hall. Catherine stepped forward, forcing calm into her voice. "I was checking the supplies, sir," she said. "Delphine was assisting me." Thomas's gaze swept over Delphine, sharp and probing. He said nothing for a moment, letting the silence stretch, letting them feel the weight of his scrutiny. Finally, he nodded curtly. "Very well. But know this, any deviation from absolute obedience, any hint of disorder, will be punished." They exhaled silently, understanding that their survival had been a narrow escape. Each day now brought a heightened danger, a reminder that love in this house was a secret that could not remain hidden forever. Judith, however, had not been idle. Her suspicion had grown into a deliberate strategy. She began collecting whispers from the servants, piecing together observations into a narrative of betrayal, defiance, and scandal. Every small misstep by Catherine or Delphine became evidence in her mind. Every glance, every touch, every word was dangerous. The tension escalated when a careless servant, perhaps jealous or perhaps frightened, let slip a hint of Catherine's nightly visits to the kitchen house. Judith heard it immediately and sensed the breakthrough she had been waiting for. Her eyes, cold and calculating, turned toward the women with a focus that was almost predatory. Catherine and Delphine, aware of the shift in the household, moved with even greater caution. They communicated in whispers and glances, avoiding any gesture that could betray their connection. Yet the fear of exposure, the knowledge that the walls of Rosewood Hall were closing in, only deepened the intensity of their bond. One night, Catherine found herself in the kitchen house, the wind howling through the windows, the fire flickering dangerously low. Delphine was there, hands busy with bread, yet her eyes betrayed the worry she felt. "They are planning," she whispered, almost to herself. "Judith will expose us." Catherine moved closer, placing a hand over Delphine's. "Then we plan too," she said. "We are clever. We can survive this together." Delphine nodded, though her heart raced. She understood that surviving would demand more than careful navigation. It would demand courage, cunning, and perhaps a willingness to risk everything. The first act of defiance came unexpectedly. Judith had arranged for the household to gather in the main hall for a winter dinner. She watched carefully, her sharp eyes scanning for signs of disorder. Catherine, knowing that any unusual behavior could be dangerous, moved with practiced grace, pretending to manage the table while keeping Delphine close in subtle ways. Their secret signals, subtle as they were, did not escape Judith. Her gaze sharpened, suspicion flaring into certainty. She began planning a confrontation, a moment when the truth could no longer be hidden. Meanwhile, Delphine and Catherine realized that survival meant more than hiding. They had to anticipate, to manipulate the very rules of the household, to create moments where they could exist without being caught. It was a dangerous dance, one misstep away from ruin. As the storm outside Rosewood Hall raged, they realized that the coming months would test them like never before. Every interaction, every glance, every word became part of a high-stakes game where love and survival collided. The plantation, once a place of routine, had become a battlefield. Catherine and Delphine understood the stakes. Thomas's authority, Judith's vigilance, and the rigid social rules of the South could destroy them at any moment. Yet even in the face of such danger, their bond grew stronger, a defiant flame in a world that demanded obedience and conformity. Outside, the wind whipped through the trees, rattling the shutters. Inside, the women prepared for what they both knew was inevitable, a confrontation that could end their secret, or end them entirely. The walls of Rosewood Hall seemed to lean in, listening, waiting, as if the house itself anticipated the horror and heartbreak to come. They had survived suspicion, survived storms, survived fear. But now, the true test had arrived. And Rosewood Hall would not forgive them for the love it was never meant to contain. I can continue with part 8 next, where Judith makes her move, Thomas begins his investigation, and the danger for Catherine and Delphine reaches its peak, keeping the suspense high and perfect for a YouTube audience. Do you want me to continue with part 8? Engaging hook for part 8. Rosewood Hall has grown colder, darker, more dangerous. Judith's suspicions are no longer whispers, they are plans, schemes designed to expose a forbidden love that defies every law, every expectation, every rule of the South. Catherine and Delphine have survived storms, secrecy, and suspicion, but now, the walls themselves seem to be closing in. Tonight, choices must be made, and the cost of love becomes terrifyingly clear. Part 8. The Confrontation. The house was silent, but silence at Rosewood Hall was never comforting. It was always deliberate, a quiet that suggested something unseen was watching. Catherine moved through the main hall with careful steps, her mind racing. Each sound, the ticking of a distant clock, the flutter of the wind through the shutters, the faint scrape of a servant's shoe, felt like a warning. Delphine was already in the kitchen house when Catherine arrived, the fire casting shadows across the walls, stretching long and threatening. Her hands were steady, folding dough, arranging utensils, but her eyes betrayed the tension she felt. Judith had made her presence known more clearly than ever before, observing, waiting, plotting. "They suspect," Delphine whispered, her voice barely audible above the fire's crackle. "Judith has been watching us more closely. Every glance, every gesture, she will notice." Catherine reached for Delphine's hand, squeezing it. "Then we need to be clever. We cannot be caught, not now." Her voice trembled slightly, betraying the fear she felt, but she forced herself to sound resolute. The danger had escalated faster than either of them had imagined. Judith had shared subtle warnings with servants, planted questions designed to draw attention to Catherine's visits, and increased her own surveillance. Thomas, though still unaware of the truth, had begun to notice patterns, small details that did not align with the orderly household he expected. Catherine and Delphine's stolen moments had become precious, but now they were increasingly fragile. Every whisper of wind or creak of floorboard became a threat. And yet, even in the shadow of discovery, their love remained intense, defiant. The first real confrontation came during dinner, a rare occasion when the Harwell family gathered formally. Catherine's hands trembled slightly as she arranged the silverware, her eyes flicking toward Delphine, who had been summoned to assist with the meal's final preparations. Judith's sharp gaze swept the room like a hawk, missing nothing. "You seem distracted tonight, Catherine," Judith said casually, though her tone carried an unmistakable edge. "Perhaps the long hours in the kitchen have exhausted you." Catherine forced a polite smile. "Yes, ma'am, the house duties are demanding, especially in winter." Judith's eyes narrowed. She did not accept the answer. She sensed, with a precision born of decades in southern households, that Catherine's distraction was not simply fatigue. Something else had taken root, something dangerous. After dinner, as servants cleared the tables and Thomas retired to his study, Judith made her move. She followed Catherine to the parlor, her steps quiet but deliberate. Catherine sensed her presence immediately, heart hammering in her chest. "Tell me," Judith said quietly, standing in the doorway, blocking Catherine's path. "What is happening in the kitchen house? I want honesty, Catherine, because I have already seen too much." Catherine's breath caught. She realized in that moment that secrecy had failed. Judith had pieced together enough to confront them, and the confrontation was inevitable. She looked at Delphine, who had entered behind her, hands clenched slightly, ready for whatever might come next. Nothing improper is happening," Catherine said, though the lie tasted bitter on her tongue. "We are merely discussing household management." Judith's gaze flicked between them, sharp and unyielding. "Do not lie to me, Catherine. I know better than anyone how this house functions. I have seen the way you linger, the way she looks at you, the way you speak in whispers." Delphine's jaw tightened. She had faced dangers before, but nothing like this. This was not a reprimand, not a misunderstanding, it was the first move toward exposure, toward destruction. She stepped slightly in front of Catherine, a protective instinct overriding caution. Judith's eyes widened slightly at the gesture, a mix of surprise and disdain crossing her face. "Do you think you can hide it behind silence or gestures?" she asked. "This will not remain secret. I will see that the truth comes to light, and when Thomas learns what you have done, there will be consequences that you cannot imagine." Catherine stepped forward, her voice gaining strength despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "Whatever you believe, whatever punishment you think you can impose, Delphine is a person. She has a name, she has feelings, she has a life. And if that is what you see as wrong, then perhaps your understanding of what is human is flawed." Judith froze, caught between shock and outrage. The words were dangerous, explosive, and unlike anything she had expected to hear. Catherine had not only defended Delphine, she had challenged the very social order that had defined their lives. "You are defying everything this household, this family, and this society stands for," Judith said finally, her voice tight with fury. "And for what?" A foolish affection, a temporary distraction. You risk everything for something that cannot exist outside these walls. It exists, Catherine said softly, almost to herself. And because it exists, it matters more than your rules, more than your threats, more than this house or your judgment. Judith turned sharply, unable to process the defiance, the audacity. She left the room with a final warning, footsteps echoing in the hall, leaving Catherine and Delphine to confront the enormity of what had just occurred. For the first time, the threat of exposure became real. Every heartbeat, every glance between them carried the weight of potential ruin. And yet, even in the face of danger, even with the shadow of discovery looming, their love endured. It was a fragile, dangerous flame, but it was theirs. That night, as the wind howled around the house and snow began to fall lightly over the fields, Catherine and Delphine huddled near the fire in the kitchen house. They spoke in whispers, their words carrying hope, fear, and determination. They knew the coming days would test them in ways they had never imagined. Rosewood Hall, once a place of routine and order, had become a battlefield. Every step, every glance, every word could tip the balance between survival and ruin. And Catherine and Delphine understood that whatever happened next would decide not only their love but their lives. Outside, the storm continued to rage, as if echoing the turmoil within the walls of Rosewood Hall. The plantation had witnessed many tragedies, many hidden stories, but none like this. The boundaries of power, desire, and survival were being tested, and history itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would come next. If you want, I can immediately create Part 9, where Thomas begins to investigate more deeply, the stakes reach a breaking point, and the horror of the plantation's power structures becomes unavoidable. Do you want me to continue with Part 9? Engaging hook for Part 9. Rosewood Hall trembles under the weight of secrets. Catherine and Delphine's love, once hidden in the shadows, is now perilously close to discovery. Every whispered word, every glance could ignite scandal. Thomas Harwell is beginning to notice discrepancies, and Judith's vigilance is relentless. In Part 9, the walls close in, danger becomes unavoidable, and the consequences of forbidden love threaten to destroy everything. Part 9, The Unraveling. Winter had settled over Milledgeville, painting the fields with frost and frosting the roof lines of Rosewood Hall. The plantation seemed peaceful from a distance, silent except for the winds wailing through the Spanish moss. But inside the house, tension thickened the air, making every movement, every glance, a calculated risk. Thomas Harwell had begun to notice small things, minor disruptions in the household routines, subtle changes in Catherine's behavior, and unexplained absences in the kitchen house. He told himself it was nothing, an adjustment to winter tasks, the normal ebb and flow of plantation life. But the sharpness of his mind, honed by years of managing both business and enslaved labor, refused to dismiss the pattern entirely. Judith, ever watchful, had reported her observations in measured, cautious tones. She did not speak of affection or love, such concepts were unthinkable, but she spoke of patterns, repeated behaviors, and small violations of order. Thomas listened politely, though he remained unconvinced that any true danger existed. He trusted his household, trusted Catherine, and trusted the strict hierarchy that had guided him for decades. Still, curiosity began to tug at him. The first moment of suspicion came one morning when he walked through the main hall and noticed Catherine's eyes lingering on the hallway leading to the kitchen house. He frowned, a prickle of unease running down his spine. It was a small thing, but in Rosewood Hall, small things mattered. Meanwhile, Catherine and Delphine had continued their clandestine meetings, now riskier than ever. The tension of Judith's scrutiny had sharpened their senses. Every knock at the door, every unexpected footstep on the stairs, set their hearts racing. They developed silent signals, brief touches, and whispered codes, an intricate choreography of secrecy that had become a lifeline. One evening, Thomas announced that he would return from Savannah earlier than expected. Catherine's stomach tightened at the news. The room she had called her sanctuary, the kitchen house, suddenly felt like a trap. Delphine, sensing the danger, grew more rigid, moving with precise efficiency to hide any trace of the hours they had spent together. "We must be cautious," Delphine whispered as Catherine entered the kitchen. "He will be here by sundown." Catherine nodded, though fear had gripped her throat. "We have to pretend. Every glance, every word, must be ordinary." When Thomas arrived, he was quiet, observing, asking questions about household affairs, the fields, the winter provisions. Catherine answered with practiced composure, hiding the tremor in her voice. Delphine moved like a shadow, attending to the fire, managing the meal, and suppressing every reaction that might betray their secret. But tension has a way of revealing itself in the smallest ways. As they carried dishes to the dining room, Thomas noticed how Catherine's hand lingered slightly longer than necessary on Delphine's shoulder. His brow furrowed, suspicion prickling at him. Later, alone in his study, Thomas began reviewing the estate ledgers, noticing inconsistencies he had overlooked before. Meals were delivered at odd times, labor records did not match expected routines, and certain tasks that required supervision appeared to have been executed with unusual precision. Each anomaly was small on its own, but together they hinted at a deviation from normal operations, a deviation he could not ignore. Catherine and Delphine, unaware that Thomas was piecing together the puzzle, continued their delicate routine. They had learned to steal moments in the shadows, speak softly when needed, and retreat when danger approached. Their love had grown in intensity, sharpened by the ever-present risk. But each stolen hour now carried the weight of potential disaster. Judith had grown restless as well. She prowled the estate, asking pointed questions of the servants, observing Delphine's every movement, and listening for whispers. She understood more than Thomas realized, and her patience was thin. The winter cold mirrored her resolve, unyielding, penetrating, and unforgiving. The first real fracture came one night when a servant accidentally left a window open in the kitchen house. A draft carried the scent of fresh bread and the warmth of the fire to the main house, unusual enough to draw Thomas's attention. He approached, curious and suspicious, and paused outside the door, listening. Inside, Catherine and Delphine froze, their hearts hammering. They could not afford to be caught, not now. Thomas knocked lightly, and Delphine forced herself to compose a smile. "Good evening, sir," she said smoothly, wiping her hands on her apron. Thomas's gaze swept the room. Something felt off. Catherine was seated near the fire, pretending to read a ledger, her fingers trembling slightly. Delphine moved as if nothing had happened, but the subtle tension in her posture betrayed her. "What are you doing in here so late?" Thomas asked, his voice calm but firm. Catherine's mind raced. "Merely reviewing household accounts, sir," she said, forcing composure. "Ensuring that the kitchen operates efficiently through the winter." Thomas's eyes narrowed. He looked from Catherine to Delphine, sensing a connection he could not define, a bond that had gone unspoken but now seemed palpable. "I see," he said slowly, leaving the room with a measured step. His mind was turning, connecting the fragments of evidence he had ignored before. The next days brought an increasing sense of urgency. Catherine and Delphine realized that their sanctuary had been compromised. Every move, every word, every glance had become a risk. They began planning, quietly, frantically, for contingencies. Should Thomas investigate further? Should Judith act more aggressively? Should a servant betray them? The stakes had never been higher. The love they shared, once a source of warmth and comfort, now carried the weight of potential ruin, threat, and violence. Every decision could mean freedom, exile, or destruction. They were caught between desire and survival, each moment a knife edge between ecstasy and catastrophe. And Rosewood Hall itself seemed to react to the tension, its long corridors and towering ceilings reflecting the fear, the secrecy, the threat of exposure. The plantation that had once seemed endless and secure now felt like a cage, a trap designed to contain not only their bodies but their hearts and their very lives. Catherine and Delphine knew that the coming weeks would decide everything. The past, the present, and the uncertain future hung together by the thinnest thread. Their love, which had once been a source of comfort and defiance, now carried the weight of impending disaster. Outside, the wind howled through the moss, as if warning them that the storm had only just begun. "If you want, I can immediately create Part 10, the final and most suspenseful conclusion, where the full consequences of their forbidden love unfold and Rosewood Hall's secrets are finally exposed. Do you want me to continue with Part 10? Engaging hook for Part 10. The walls of Rosewood Hall are closing in. Secrets that were hidden for years are about to explode into the open. Catherine and Delphine's forbidden love has reached its breaking point. The people they trusted may turn against them. In Part 10, every choice, every emotion, and every risk comes to a devastating climax. History tried to erase this story, but now, the truth will finally be revealed. Part 10, The Shattering. The frost lay thick over the fields, and Rosewood Hall appeared as quiet as a tomb. Inside, the tension had become almost unbearable. Catherine and Delphine knew that one misstep could end everything. Thomas had begun asking pointed questions, and Judith's silent vigilance had grown sharper with every passing day. For months, Catherine and Delphine had lived in a world of stolen moments, secret smiles, and whispered conversations. Now, the world outside their sanctuary pressed closer than ever. Every glance from a servant, every creak in the floorboards, every rustle of the wind through the trees felt like a warning. Thomas's suspicion had reached a tipping point. He noticed the way Catherine moved, the subtle gestures she made, and the fleeting glances toward the kitchen house. He began tracking her time with unusual precision, recording her activities in his ledger with a meticulousness that mirrored the plantation accounts. Something was off, and he was determined to uncover it. One cold morning, Thomas entered the kitchen house without warning. Catherine and Delphine were arranging ingredients for the day, trying to appear calm and ordinary. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth barely masking the tension in the room. "Good morning," Thomas said, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. "I need to speak with you, Catherine." Catherine's heart raced, but she stood straight, forcing a composure that she did not feel. Delphine moved behind her, hands trembling ever so slightly as she wiped a counter. They both knew the moment had come. In the main hall, Thomas confronted Catherine about the unusual patterns, the late-night visits, the discrepancies in the household schedule. He spoke carefully, as though he were testing her reaction. Catherine answered honestly, her voice steady, but careful. She admitted nothing that could condemn Delphine, nothing that would betray the fragile sanctuary they had built. "You are hiding something," Thomas said finally, his eyes searching hers. "I do not yet know what, but it is clear that my household is not entirely as it should be." Judith appeared then, as if summoned by the tension itself. She had been following, observing, waiting for the precise moment to confront the truth. Her expression was rigid, her hands clenched. "Brother, I believe it is time you knew," she said. Catherine felt Delphine's hand brush against hers, a fleeting touch of reassurance, and she drew a deep breath. It was the last moment they would share in private. Judith laid out what she had observed, the lingering glances, the intimate gestures, the patterns of secrecy. She did not speak of love or emotion, only of violations of order, disruptions of hierarchy, and the transgression of the invisible laws that governed the plantation. Thomas listened in silence, piecing together the fragments, until at last he turned to Catherine. "Is this true?" he asked quietly, his voice edged with disbelief and anger. Catherine did not hesitate. "Yes, it is true," she said. "I have been with Delphine. I have cared for her. I have loved her." For a long moment, silence filled the room. The weight of her words hung in the air like smoke. Delphine stood behind her, rigid with fear, every muscle coiled for survival. Thomas's face was unreadable, a storm hidden behind composed features. "You understand what this means?" he finally asked. "The law, the society, the very world we live in, this is unacceptable. You, Catherine, and you, Delphine, have defied everything that should have kept us safe and orderly." Catherine nodded. "I understand," she said. "But it was real. Whatever happens now, it was real." Thomas paused, then spoke with a cold calculation. "Catherine, your position is compromised. Your marriage, your family, everything rests on appearances. Delphine, as my property, is subject to consequences that are severe." The room seemed to contract. Every heartbeat thundered in Catherine's ears. Delphine felt the threat of the auction block, of separation, of the final, absolute loss of everything she had ever known. Judith intervened. "Brother, the law allows us to act, but it does not dictate cruelty. Perhaps there is a way to mitigate the damage." Thomas considered this, eyes flicking between the two women. "We cannot ignore what has occurred, but neither can we allow it to destroy everyone immediately. You will remain here, under strict supervision. Any further indiscretion, and the consequences will be final." Catherine and Delphine exhaled slightly, the first relief in months, but they knew the danger had only shifted, not disappeared. They had survived the storm, but the sky was still dark, the future uncertain. Over the next weeks, life at Rosewood Hall returned to a fragile semblance of normality. Catherine resumed her duties as mistress of the house with renewed caution. Delphine continued to run the kitchen, her skill unquestioned, her presence tolerated. The stolen moments were gone, replaced by silent understanding and careful navigation of every glance, every gesture. Yet beneath the surface, something had changed forever. Catherine and Delphine's love could not be erased. It existed in their memories, in the subtle touches, in the quiet understanding that had grown in the shadow of fear. It was a secret that belonged only to them, an ember of defiance against a world built on cruelty and control. History tried to erase their story. Records were sealed, pages removed, and accounts carefully scrubbed. But the truth endures, whispered in the hallways of Rosewood, in the kitchens where the fire still burns, in the eyes of those who have listened and remembered. Catherine and Delphine's love was not a story of triumph, nor one of happy endings. It was a story of survival, of courage, of humanity in a world determined to strip it away. And it remains a warning, a testament to the ways people can find connection even in the darkest of circumstances. Rosewood Hall still stands, its walls heavy with silence, its floors worn by the steps of those who came before. And if you listen carefully, you can hear the echoes of laughter, whispered words, and the enduring pulse of a love that could not, and would not, be entirely extinguished. If you were captivated by this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more hidden histories and forbidden tales. Hit the notification bell to never miss a part of our series. Share this story with friends who love history and suspense, and leave a comment telling us what state you're watching from. Your thoughts keep these stories alive. Thumbnail word suggestion: Forbidden Love, Rosewood Secrets, Hidden Desire.